welcome back to day 6, chapter 6 of Love and Lovecraft. After yesterday, which was so long, you may be happy to hear that it's very cold in my studio today, so I'll probably be reading a little quicker because I want to get back inside where it's warm. So, let's get started. Chapter 6. The door flew open to reveal a horsey face atop a bony body, dressed in an expensive black suit and crisp white cravat. The man's eyes were goggled, and his high cheekbones were sharply arched, giving him the appearance of a deep-water eel brought rapidly to the ocean's surface. This impression was only enhanced by the pale, fishy pallor of his skin. His greasy hair, slicked with macassar oil and neatly parted in the middle, and his aura of haughty disinterest. On his narrow nose, he wore a most curious set of eyeglasses. They were comprised of 3 lenses, one layered upon the other, and held in place by silvered filigree work and brass hinges. 2 of the lenses had been flipped up, so that he stared at me through a single pair tinted blue. By my quick estimate, he was a year or 2 older than me, approaching 30. He looked up, down, behind me, directly to me, his expression darting from interest to snooty disdain to disgust, with the speed of a flittering sardine. "What do you want?" he said, his voice pitched low with revulsion. "Mr. Blackwood?" I said with surprise. Yes, it is. Yes, I am. What do you want?" I held out my hand and tried not to cringe when he took it in his own clammy grip. "I wish to make your acquaintance, sir, as we are neighbors. My name is Harriet Lovecraft." His touch felt reluctant and squeamish. It brimmed with revulsion. "Miss Lovecraft, is it?" he said, withdrawing his hand and wiping it on his jacket. He flipped another pair of lenses down, red ones, so that he examined me through 2 lenses instead of 1. "Look at you." "Me?" "Yes, who else?" He flipped down the 3rd, these ones silvery green, and nodded. "Your mission is accomplished, Miss Lovecraft. We've been acquainted. Now go away." He began to close the door. "Have you heard about the missing boy?" I asked. That gave him pause. He stared at me hard with those oversized peepers, then flipped all 3 sets of lenses up to better regard me without impediment. "What boy?" "Earl Rabbit," I said, "the baker's son. One of the youths from the village. He's disappeared." One lip curled up. How dreadful. I narrowed my gaze. "You don't sound very concerned." He caught himself, and purposefully increased his measure of emotion. "Of course it's a tragedy, but I've never met the lad. If you're looking for him, I haven't seen him. I haven't even left the grounds today. I know nothing about this affair at all." He started to close the door again, so I set my boot against the frame. I was not done with him yet, not after so many days of being denied the answers to my curiosity. "If I may be so bold," I said, "it would be in your best interest to visit the village and introduce yourself to the good people of Dunham. They've started to suspect you of being antisocial, and a quick hello might assuage their fears and keep them from bringing torches and pitchforks to your yard." I gave him a pleasing smile. "A precautionary measure, if you understand." "If you may be so bold, I've seen no indication that you are anything else," he replied. His goggle eyes narrowed, his fishy lips pulled down in a persnickety scowl. "Why ask my permission? Your boldness, your audacity, seems to exist without boundaries and under no man's authority. But," his expression mellowed, "but your suggestion is not without merit. It's very kind of you to be concerned for my reputation." "You're my neighbor, sir. If you're innocent of any wrongdoing, I should want you to be well regarded." I looked at him askance. "Have you seen anything strange around Northwich Hall?" "No." "Nothing? No hint of the boy in your garden?" "None." After a moment's consideration, I added, "No large beasts lurking in your wood?" He paused at that, and narrowed his eyes even more. "What kind of beast?" "I'm not certain," I replied. "A snake, perhaps. I was only afforded a glimpse, but it was huge and multicolored, and it moved through the trees without effort." "How precise a description," he said with deep suspicion. "Tell me, Miss Lovecraft, does hysteria run in your family?" I scowled. "Quite assuredly no." "Any weakness of the mind? Are you prone to fits or fainting spells?" "Of course not," I replied. "You think I hallucinated?" He scowled back. "I suspect it was nothing more than a trick of the light, don't you? I certainly would exercise caution in sharing my experiences, lest someone mistake my stories for lunacy." We stared at one another for a heartbeat. He examined me for any hint of rising insult, and I returned the examination to judge if he was baiting me. "Well," at last I said firmly, "thank you for returning my basket and shawl. I hope you enjoyed the bread and cheese and found the book of interest. The wine was my father's vintage from the grapes on the south side of our cottage." He blinked twice. "Cheese? Wine? What the devil are you talking about?" I furrowed my brow. "The gift I left on your doorstep. You brought back the basket with a note of thanks and left it by our frog pond." "I did no such thing," he began, then stopped abruptly. "Oh, yes, eating food." His eyes grew mean and cold. "And reading material, too. How very lucky I am to have such a generous neighbor who knows the worth of a good book." "I must go, Miss Lovecraft. Do not come back." He shunted my boot from the threshold and slammed the heavy door. I heard the chunky, decisive clunk of a lock. I stood long enough at the window that I saw the curtains move in the upper window, and Mr. Blackwood stared out to see if I remained, and when he saw me, he flapped his hand to urge me to leave. What a wretched cur! I didn't think he had anything to do with Earl's disappearance, but that didn't keep me from the impression that he was sparse, spiteful, and secretive, and I didn't like him much. I turned on one heel and began to walk across the lawns homeward, my head held high. But to my immense surprise, a few minutes later, I was hailed by that same gentleman, and when I turned my head towards Northwich Hall, Mr. Blackwood was hurrying to catch me across the broad open land and wild grasses, a tall hat on his head and a black jacket flapping over his shoulders. He'd removed his glasses and now carried a fancy ebony walking stick. When he pulled a pace, he was panting heavily from exertion, and 2 rosy spots had risen to his cheeks. His beaver hat was of the finest quality I'd ever seen, and his long black coat was trimmed with a luxurious silver-tipped fur collar. The head of his cane was a silver fish with emerald eyes, identical to the one held by the man in the portrait in Northwich Hall's ballroom. Once he'd caught his breath, he said, "I've suffered a change of heart. Let me accompany you." "Well, thank you. That's very kind, sir." "Upon reflection, I think you may be right, Miss Lovecraft. I've been reclusive, and that will not serve me best in this community. Perhaps you would be generous enough to introduce me to your father and mother." "It would be my pleasure," I said. "The village is very small. A visit won't take much time away from your more important pursuits. I've heard you have a plethora of packages that come and go from Northwich Hall." He gave a pinched, pained smile. "It seems the villagers already know a few facts about me." "Mrs. Runkle, the postmistress, she keeps a close watch on the public." And what is it that you do, Miss Lovecraft?" he asked as we fell into step with each other. "Can I expect this conversation to be broadcast so widely?" "I try to restrain myself from idle gossip, sir," I said. "My sisters and I help keep the house and gardens. I also look after the town library. Jane teaches piano to the younger girls, and Mary leads the village choir. Emma does not do much at all, given the choice." "Ah, yes, there are 4 of you," he said. "I was in the upper window when you first dropped by." He gave a chuckle at remembering. "You left in quite a hurry." I slowed my step, forming my next question with deliberation. "Your front door was open, sir, and I was afraid that vermin would come inside, so I made to close it. I took a moment to admire your furnishings, for the hall has been vacant for so long, and I caught sight of something curious in the shadows." I stole a glimpse at his face. "It gave me a fright." He appeared stern and unmoved. "One of the statues?" "I am certain it was not." "Well, I live alone," he replied. "No staff to assist you?" "None." "I'm quite sure I saw someone." "Perhaps it was a ghost." I raised one eyebrow in his direction. "Do you know the history of Northwich Hall?" His eyes glanced quickly at me. A curious curl appeared over his mouth, the faintest hint of a mocking smile. "Do you?" We walked 5 or 6 steps before I said, "I thought I did, but I've been informed that there's more to this story, and I'm not sure if I can honestly answer your question. I thought I knew, but now I suspect I do not." "It's healthy to question the limits of your knowledge from time to time," he said. "You speak of the Posey family, I assume. It's a curious history, but I'm unconcerned by hearsay and old wives' tales." "I can assure you it's not hearsay. A very real tragedy happened to the Poseys." "Terrible things have happened over every square inch of this earth, Miss Lovecraft. We'd have no choice but to cower in our beds if we wished to avoid all hauntings and spooks." He waved one hand in the direction of the northern forests. I bet there was some great battle waged on that hillside in long ago times, or a tragic murder in those dreadful woods, or a highwayman that stalked his victims on the mill road. The list of sad events goes on and on. Given enough time, every place becomes stained. His philosophical rationalization did not fool me. Well, while that's quite true, I don't think this is an instance of mere coincidence, sir. I was told you were willing to pay any price for the property. Good Lord, you are very well informed, Miss Lovecraft, he said. Northwich Hall is a fine house. I've seen only a few that are finer, and none of them were for sale. He waved his cane around his head. Long, lush pastures, a deep forest and a river, gardens and cellars and towers. I'd be a fool not to purchase it. We crossed the open lawn and entered into the small path that linked Northwich Hall with my own small cottage, up a weedy incline and through the green wooden gate of the stone fence. I also heard you were a fur trader? No, not me, but my father, he replied. He amassed a great fortune off the land and rose through the ranks to become a man of learning. But I'm not designed for such a rustic life, and doubt very much that I'd succeed on the same path that he took. I am a scholar, Miss Lovecraft, and not particularly suited for the bitter cold or hard labor of living rough. I wished to pursue my interest in science, but I soon exhausted all libraries and resources, from Alaska to Mexico, and when my father left me in possession of a comfortable fortune, I decided to relocate to Dunham. It may be small, but at least it's better connected to the universities of London and Berlin. You're a man of science. I should introduce you to my sister Mary, I replied. She's a natural philosopher at heart. We'd reached the back door of my cottage. I gave a polite knock before opening it. My mother, summoned from the breakfast room by the sound of my tapping, was very surprised to lay her sight upon the man behind me. Good afternoon, sir, she said, questioning. Mamma, may I present Mr. Aloysius Blackwood? She gave a squawk like a chicken, as if a jolt of electricity had run through her. How wonderful to meet you, she said, taking his hand in hers and pumping madly. Do come in. Tea, scones, Beatrice, put the kettle on, and gather a nice selection of nibbles for our guest. Come in, come in. We are very delighted to make your acquaintance. Mr. Blackwood found himself dragged into the parlor. Harry, where are your sisters? Go and fetch them. Tell them we have an honored guest. Be quick about it, girl. I think they may still be in the village, I said. I left them with Mrs. Chowder. Well, then run. Go now. 'Tis only 2 miles. I shall keep Mr. Blackwood entertained until you return. Sir, will you dine with us this evening? How lovely it is to make your acquaintance. Did the gentleman give me a pleading glance for help? I think he may. But before he could be fully exposed to my mother's marital manipulations and introduced to all of her daughters of suitable age, I heard my father shouting from the roadway. We rushed out to the yard, all of us, Mamma, me, Beatrice, and Mr. Blackwood together. Papa jogged up the road, waving his hands over his head. The boy has been found, he yelled, straining to catch his breath. From his sickly complexion and his stricken expression, the news could not be good. Where? I asked. But Papa had run too far. He leaned against the huntsman's oak, chest heaving, trying to form words. The upper footbridge, he gasped. I was just there not half an hour ago, I said. But my father, long acquainted with his daughter's quirks, grabbed my wrist. He could not tell me with words, but Papa knew me and my talent. He could impart with touch the full spectrum of emotions that he felt, and that would work to his satisfaction. Icy dread flowed up from his strong fingers, a horror beyond words. My father, normally a bastion of sedate logic and placid clemency, was utterly terrified. No further explanation was required. I gathered up my skirts and sprinted as fast as my boots would carry me, back through the garden and over the Northwich pastures, towards the river valley and the footbridge. When I arrived at the north shore of the Dunham River, a clutch of men were disassembling the walking bridge with axes and iron bars. At first I misread their actions and thought them to be pulling Earl from under the water. But then I noticed that they were hacking chunks of wood from the plain fir and extracting him from the very heart of the tree. Mr. Tippler watched from the shore, puffing on his pipe. What are they doing? I asked. A section of bridge fractured and splintered. The men strained and tugged, and levered open the tree along its grain. Well, he's all caught up now, ain't he? Said Mr. Tippler. The men, some of them turning green, began extracting strips of flesh from the wood. He's embedded in the underside of the walking bridge, I said with an extraordinary measure of confusion. Tippler breathed out a puff of smoke. Aye, that's what it looks like. He waggled his fingers. I heard that Teddy Crumpsall came back this way after meeting with you, and he noticed that the old bridge had sprouted a few fresh leaves. Thinking that to be mighty queer, he bent over the side to examine it, and spotted a bare foot sticking out of the bridge on the far side, as if the old tree had come to life and grown around the body. He shook his head slowly and drew on his pipe once more, then said in a low and grave voice, "The work of the devil, I say. This is wicked magic." I fumbled for words. The bridge was made of a single solid tree without boards or nails. How could such a thing be possible? I watched as the men used fingers and axe blades to pry strips of human flesh from the inner core of the trunk. Red blood ran like fresh sap. How can this be? The old tinker just looked at me, shrugged, and puffed on his pipe. There was a cry and shouts of exclamation as more of the body was revealed. The clamor frightened a scattering of starlings silently roosting in a nearby tree. The men rushed to carve more of the time-worn trunk away, revealing a face lodged in the heartwood. The young nose was smashed, the dull eyes were open but spiny with splinters, and the rough texture of the wood had scraped most of the skin into raw meat. Had he been alive when entombed in the tree? Good Lord, there were scratches and blood, signs that he'd fought against his imprisonment, howsoever such a thing was achieved. A terrible thought occurred to me. I'd crossed the bridge on my way to Northwich Hall and chatted cheerfully with the Crumpsalls, and at that very moment I'd walked directly over the body of poor tortured Earl Rabbit, his trapped face only inches from the soles of my feet. That's the end of today's chapter. We'll see you again tomorrow. Bye!